Charley Parkhurst was a driver, a coachman and survivor in a world of danger and gold. Riding round the mountain, whippings on second counting, whether weather was hot or cold. Charley onward, ho, best knight of the mountain whip. Charley onward, ho, your life has been a wild coach trip. I would like to tell you the true story of Charley Parkhurst, one of the very finest stagecoach drivers in the gold rush days in California. Now, Charley Parkhurst was born in 1812, and it was in Vermont. Sadly, his parents died when he was 2 years old, and he had to be taken off to an orphanage. Well, you can imagine, living in an orphanage is not a whole lot of fun. So Charley ran away at age 12. He ended up getting a job as a stable boy for a man in Massachusetts. And when that man moved to Rhode Island, he took Charley with him. Charley became an expert at working with horses, and he discovered that horses loved him and he loved horses. And that became his lifetime passion. There were friends he'd met in Rhode Island who got inspired by the gold rush to migrate to California. They went across the prairie. But when Charley decided to follow them later on, he decided to go a different way. He migrated from Boston down to Panama in a steamship. And then he would walk across Panama being assisted by the Panamanian natives, and that was the tradition back then. Then he would get on a sailing ship and he would go sailing up to San Francisco. And that's how things happened back then, and I'm familiar with that because that's how my great-grandfather came to California. When Charley came up to San Francisco, he got a hold of his Rhode Island friends, and they had started the California Stagecoach Company. They gave him a job. His very first route was going from Oakland to San Jose. And Charley looked at that and he thought, driving 4 horses across that straight road, no problem at all. Well, he got so bored with it, he started working at night too, and he would do double shifts and earn double pay. Once in Redwood City, he was shoeing a horse and it kicked him in the eye, and he lost his left eye, and he had to wear an eye patch the whole rest of his life. And people started calling him One-Eyed Charley, but not to his face. When the gold rush bloomed and blossomed, Charley got intrigued with the challenge of it all, and he started working for Wells Fargo and other places, and he would drive from Sacramento to Placerville, from Stockton to Merced, and many other routes. Now that was a whole lot harder to do, and very few people were good at it. Those who were good at it, they were called the Knights of the Whip. Charley was one of the very best Knights of the Whip. It would take a real skill to handle 6 horses. You'd be going up steep hills, down steep hills, around sharp mountain curves, rocky roads, narrow lanes. Who knows what the weather was like? It would also take a huge amount of muscles to be pulling on the brakes all the way down the hill so that the coach wouldn't overrun the horses. Charley was definitely one of the Knights of the Whip. People used to talk about Charley's skills, and they would be rather frightened by them because they would say that if Charley was 15 paces from you, he could whip a cigar right out of your mouth without causing any pain at all. That was impressive. Now, Charley was pretty much a loner, and he would hang out with his horse buddies and talk to them a lot more than he would with his driver buddies. But at night, he would go to the saloon and he would smoke cigars and he would drink beer and he'd roll dice to see who'd pay for the beer. But he was more of a silent sort of fellow. And when everybody else got dirty, well, Charley would get dirty too. He would be in the corral working with the horses. And amazingly, even though he lost his eye to one of the horses, it didn't stop him from loving horses. He worked with horses all the time, and when it was winter time, there would be mud up to his axle, but he'd keep working. But when it was nighttime and you were going off to a saloon, oh, Charley dressed with style. Charley had one of those short, crowned felt hats, lined with silver conchos. He had gauntlets that were made out of the finest buckskin by the Indians. They were beaded and they had fringes on them. Charley would wear a fine jacket, pleated shirt over his barrel chest, and handmade, handcrafted, fine leather boots with 3-inch heels. Well, Charley kept hearing people talk, even though he was quiet. And after a while, he got real tired of hearing one of his driving buddies, Hank Monk, talking about having taken a very famous guy, Horace Greeley. And Charley was so sick of hearing this. Hank went on for the umpteenth time saying, I drove Horace Greeley to Placerville. He was going to be giving a speech, and it was raining, and we didn't want to be late, so I was whipping up them horses, and we went on, and Horace is leaning out of the side, and he's going, slow down. And I said, keep your seat, Mr. Greeley, I'll get you there in time. And he's bouncing around like a rubber ball, but I got him there on time, and I got myself in the papers for it. Charley was tired of hearing that, and he finally just spoke up and he said, well, Hank, if braggins was brains, you'd be a genius. People laughed so hard at that, Hank stopped bragging for a whole week. But Charley had stories to tell too. There was a lot of rain one spring, and the Tuolumne River was overflowing, and there was a wooden bridge that Charley had to cross, and he knew it. He knew it was dangerous, but he was whipping on. He had a big strong box of gold under his seat. He had a passenger in there, and he's whipping along, and all of a sudden, just in front of the bridge, there came a man out in a slicker saying, stop, stop. Charley pulled to a halt, and he says, you don't want to go over there? It's going to break down any minute now. You got to turn back. And the passenger leaned out, and he said, we can wait. Let's not chance it. And Charley nodded, and he looked down at the strongbox he'd promised to deliver, and he went, yah! And those horses lurched ahead, full gallop, went across that bridge, slipping and sliding. The water was already going over the bridge, and they got to the other side and pulled to a halt, and they looked back just in time to see that bridge fall to pieces and wash down the river. The passenger was so terrified, said, good Lord, I thought for sure that we were going to die and that we were going to be washed down that river together. But, you know, Charley was pretty calm about that, and he said, well, I would never let something like that happen. No, I'm mighty particular about who I bathe with. Well, times went on. And people would gather again. They would gather in that saloon, and they all knew each other, but Charley was still being pretty quiet, still smoking cigars on and on. And he heard another fella barking away about a big cargo he brought in. It was a load of dancing girls. And this fella was saying, hey, Charley, you ought to see them dancing girls. Oh my God, they hardly wear anything when they're dancing. I think one of them has legs so long it goes up to her eyebrows. Everybody just laughed, but not Charley. Charley didn't go anything but, huh. Well, the driver didn't want to hear it that way. So he said to the other fellas, he said, well, it seems like Charley don't know nothing about women. He just knows about horses. And again, Charley went, huh, you'd be surprised how much I know about women, but I knows enough to keep away from them. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. So they left him alone on that one. Now, Charley went on and did all sorts of things. He would drive this way and that way and got so many famous people going up there. And he had another story to tell about how these things went on, because it wasn't just Mother Nature that was a problem. There was also highwaymen that would stop you. Well, Charley was going on his way to Merced, around a steep mountain, and two fellows came out. One of them grabbed the reins of the horse, and one of them had a double-barreled shotgun. "Drop down that strong box." It was full of gold. Charley had no choice, and he said, "Boom! I suppose you're that low-down sugarfoot." And the fellow with the scarf over his face just laughed, and he said, "Yeah, you're just gonna have to confess now, Charley. Sugarfoot got the best of you." Charley said, "You ever do this to me again, Sugarfoot, I'm gonna put daylight through that liver of yours." 2 months later, in almost exactly the same spot, two men came out again with a double-barreled shotgun. "Put down that strong box." Well, Charley had gotten smart after that. He decided to keep a loaded pistol under his seat. So he leaned down like he was going to go get the strong box. And then he jerked on the reins, and the two front horses lurched up. And the men were so distracted by that, it gave our hero just long enough to reach down for the pistol. Two shots rang out. One of them grabbed his stomach, and the other one ran off to his horse and clattered on up the hills. The other one stumbled over to his horse, got on it, and ran away. A week later, they found one of them dead in a cabin up the hills, and he was identified as Sugarfoot. Driving a stagecoach wagon felt like wrestling with the dragon, but Charley did not slip. He could manage 6 horses, such duty he enforces, whipping cigars right from your lip. Charley onward, ho, best knight of the western whip. Charley onward, ho, your life has been a wild coach trip. Now, hanging out in those saloons was a lot of smoking. And I think Charley lost part of his voice doing that. All these fellas going around a sharp curve like that, they would have to yell out that they were coming in case somebody was coming the other way. But Charley really couldn't do that. He'd been smoking cigars too long. So he carried a horn, and he would go, "Oh!" every time he went around the curve, and he became famous for that one too. After a while, Charley became fragile enough, stiff in the joints, older, and he decided it was time to stop driving. He'd been driving for 30 years. So he left that alone, and he took his savings, and he went and he bought a farm over by Santa Cruz. And there he started raising chickens and cattle, and of course his beloved horses. Now, there turned out to be a neighbor of his, a widow woman and her daughter, and they were losing their ranch to foreclosure. Well, kind-hearted Charley felt sorry for him. He took his savings and he bought that ranch and just gave it to them. He was a kind-hearted man, gruff as he could be. Well, after a while, even working with this ranch, that got to be too much for him too. But he did register himself to vote in 1868. Charley Darky Parkhurst. And he was in that federal election, trying to vote between Ulysses S. Grant and Horatio Seymour. I wish we knew which one he voted for. Then he moved to a cabin and settled down into that cabin, and he was looking pretty frail. His friends would come in and they'd visit him and they'd say, oh, Parky, you're looking bad. Can we bring a doctor to you? And Charley would put his hand on his pistol and say, "If I die, I die. Ain't no doctor poking at me." They could tell he had cancer in his mouth from all that smoking. A week later, a friend came back to visit Charley, and there he was on his bunk, dead. Now, Charley was a secretive loner all his life. One of his biggest secrets was revealed when the coroner looked over his body and announced to the public, Charley Parkhurst was a woman. Now, the San Francisco Call papers, they printed that up in an obituary, and they honored Charley. They said he was one of the best of the Knights of the Whip, so skilled. But then that put the word out. And his old buddy, Hank Monk, when he read that, he was horrified. He said, "Gee, Jehoshaphat, Parky and I went camping for a whole week together. We were sleeping on the same buffalo robes. How could I not have known this?" Now, Charley also used to work, when he had the farm, he would go lumbering in the wintertime, and he worked for the Clarks. One day, Charley had come home just dead drunk. And Mrs. Clark told to her 17-year-old son, "Put Charley to bed." A few minutes later, the son went dashing to his mother and he said, "Ma, Charley ain't no man, he's a woman." But the Clarks did not say anything about this till after Charley died. It would be a fascinating thing to find out who Charley voted for, but I would imagine one of the freedoms that Charley had was having been able to vote in the very first election as a woman. And in California, probably the first woman to ever cast any vote. It turns out her name was Charlotte Parkhurst. And she must have wanted more freedom than women had in those days. So she dressed as a man and changed her name and migrated to California. And as gruff as Charley could be, she did have a kind heart. In her will, she left $600 to a 12-year-old neighborhood boy. And the boy's father put up a little headstone for Charley. "Charley became a farmer, a lumberjack and charmer. His neighbors loved him so. He voted for the first time, committing a true crime. Was he an odd fellow? I'd say so. Charley onward, ho! Best knight of the western whip. Charley onward, ho! Your life has been a wild coach trip." Later on, 1955, the historians put up a large monument for Charley Parkhurst. And when I was doing my research on Charley, I went to see that monument. And I was delighted to find out they had buried Charley Parkhurst in the section of the Odd Fellows. What could be more appropriate?